Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, a prototype self-defense knife. So probably the coolest thing about knife making to me is that you're in charge, you run the show, and so you always get to do something that you want to do. And for me, I'm interested in kind of pushing boundaries and trying new things. That's what a prototype is all about. You're not trying to make a perfect knife, you're trying to test a concept and see if it works. So that's what we're going to be doing today. A shooting buddy of mine, Peter Renwick, he's a shooting instructor, and he carries a knife routinely with him, and he's sort of wanted to do a knife that was a little bit of a spin on a knife that he already carries. Basically, the idea is that you'd be able to carry it up front and draw it fairly easily and extend it out almost as you would carry a gun. That sort of gives continuity for him because he's basically a shooter first and doesn't have a lot of training with a knife. So this seemed like kind of a natural design for him. So, cool thing about doing prototypes is that you never know quite what you're going to get. So we're just going to launch into this thing and give it a whirl and see if we end up with a knife that's cool, and you can follow along on our little journey. This design started with my friend Peter Renwick cutting out this somewhat impressionistic paper model on the top of a gun store counter. Now, Peter's a firearms trainer, an IDPA master level shooter, and an all-round good guy, so I figured it was worth taking his idea down the road a little and seeing where it led. I'll be making the knife from 1095 high carbon steel, 2 inches wide and 1/8 inch thick. I sketched out the rough shape on the steel so as to locate the holes I'd be drilling for the 2 handle pins. I'm using blind bolt pins, which make a nice clean handle look. I'll show how that works later. I should have cleaned off the scale first, but I'll go ahead and do that now that I'm finished drilling. This could be done with a surface grinder, an abrasive blaster, with sandpaper, or like this. Next, I'll grind the profile of the blade on the table of my belt grinder. Now, since I'm working from an extremely rough design, I take a lot of time as I go to test the feel in my hand, as well as to try and make the lines flow visually. As you get closer to something that starts to look vaguely non-awful, you want to slow down and try not to overshoot. We've talked about the basic idea earlier, but Peter's theory for the blade is that it should be able to pierce or slice. This particular design with its Wharncliffe blade kind of splits the difference, but it's clearly more suited for slicing than stabbing. An alternative approach might be to make a tanto point, a clip point with a sharpened edge, or even a dagger fully sharpened on both edges. But we're sticking with this approach for now. To that end, I'll test it a little using thrusting techniques against a stationary piece of wood. The idea being to make sure that under a very hefty impact, it doesn't slip, doesn't hurt my hand, or cause my fingers to slip forward on the blade where I'd end up cutting myself. It passes the test just fine. The pistol grip allows you to hold it very tightly and absorb a lot of impact force. Next, I'll show the grinding of the bevel. As I mentioned, this is what's known as a Wharncliffe blade. That is a blade that goes completely straight on the cutting edge. It's excellent for slicing. Ideal for this application? We'll see. We'll be using the time-tested and durable material micarta for the handle. Micarta is a laminate which comes in several grades. Laminated from paper, canvas, or linen, each one of which has its own advantages and disadvantages. We're using black linen here. I think linen is by far the most attractive, though canvas offers better grip for the hand. I actually did the handle in several stages, but I'll show the initial phases all at one time. I'll begin with a couple of pieces of micarta, which I'll drill using the prototype blade as a template. It's important if you use this approach to use locator pins of some sort to make sure everything lines up perfectly. In this case, I'm just using extra drill bits in the same diameter as the holes. Next, I'll use a step drill, which will cut a ledge to seat the head of the blind bolt handle pins. I can use the press's gauge or a stop to make sure all the steps are drilled to the same depth. You'll see how all this comes together once we fasten the pins. Once I've tested to make sure they fit, I'll profile the front edge of the handle. No matter how you intend to proceed, this part has to be done before attaching the handle scales, or you'll end up scratching your finished blade. In this case, however, I'm going to give the blade an epoxy coating to inhibit rust, so I'll need the scale to fit the exact profile of the blade before I ever finish it. This is fairly easily accomplished on the grinder. Alright, let me step backward a little. As I said, I did the handle in several steps. The reason for this is that I heat treated the blade in between stages. If you're new to knife making, heat treating is the process of causing steel to harden to the ideal level for a particular application. There are several different stages to it, each of which involves heating and cooling in very specific ways. In this case, I'm using a forge for heat treating, but any heat source of sufficient heat output will do. For those of you who don't have lots of knife making equipment, you don't have to bail out now. This is something that can be accomplished with plain old charcoal. I'm going to do a video on the subject of how to heat treat with charcoal fairly soon. When it's done, I'll post a link here. Anyway, in this case, I'll be heating the steel to roughly 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 800 Celsius. If you'd like to know more about the hows and whys of heat treating, I've got a number of other videos that go into heat treating in more detail. I won't take up your time by going over all the details right here. Suffice it to say, if you don't suit the heat treating to the specific steel you're using, your knife won't be worth a damn. I'm quenching the blade in oil. I prefer peanut oil because it produces less toxic smoke than, say, used motor oil, but many oils will work fine. From transmission fluid to canola oil to mineral oil to specialized quenching oils. After quenching, the blade is now hardened. Using this particular combination of steel and oil produces a differential hardening, similar to that found on Japanese swords, giving it an excellent combination of hardness and toughness. Next, I'll temper the blade for 2 1-hour cycles at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Tempering softens the steel. Without tempering, the blade would be too hard, meaning that it would be quite brittle and prone to shattering under impact. If you do everything right, the end result should be an edge around 60 on the Rockwell C scale. That's pretty hard. After heat treating, the blade is abrasive blasted using aluminum oxide abrasive media. I did this in several stages, but I could have simply done it all at once after profiling the handle. In any case, the end result is this matte finish. Now, this finish could be done as an end in itself, but in this case I'm doing it as surface prep for the next step, applying an epoxy-based firearms type finish. There are a number of firearms type coatings on the market: Cerakote, Duracoat, and various others, including the finish I'm using here, moly resin, produced by John Norell Incorporated. They all have their unique qualities and their own advantages and disadvantages. But moly resin particularly suits my needs for this project. Firearms coatings can be quite useful both for decorative purposes and to inhibit rust on carbon steels like 1095. I'm using it for both. In this case, I'm using one of several black colors that Norell produces. It's crucial in applying these sorts of finishes that the material is meticulously prepped. There are various ways to do this, but the bottom line is that you need sufficient tooth on the surface so that it will accept the finish, and you need it degreased so that there are no barriers whatsoever between steel and coating. If there are, it'll all just flake off. This means no fingers touching the steel after prep. In this case, I simply sandblast the material and I'm ready to go. Moly resin is applied in thin coats to steel that should be heated to around 100 degrees. I use a heat gun to heat it. This will cause the solvents in the coating to flash off the steel, making drips and thick spots less likely. Still, I'm pretty careful to apply the coating in extremely rapid motions. I've found from hard experience that you can make moly resin look pretty ugly if you try to apply the coating too thickly at one time. A series of very, very thin coats gives the best results. The applicator is a high-quality airbrush. Incidentally, I'm going to be doing a compare and contrast video of various firearms finishes fairly soon. When that's ready, I'll post a link here. Once the blade's fully coated, I'll heat it for an hour at 300 degrees Fahrenheit in my heat treating oven. The result is a quite durable and attractive finish. Most manufacturers of these types of coatings produce everything from uber tactical colors like flat dark earth to lurid colors like pink and safety orange. Firearms coatings are a great add to a knife, both for functional reasons and to give a little custom pop to a blade. In fact, some of them are reasonably easy to use and are a fun way to give a custom touch to production knives too. Now we'll go ahead and attach the handle scales. As we alluded, I'm using blind bolts. The waist of the bolt fits into the narrow hole, while the top fits into the larger hole drilled by the step drill. I'm using a knife making epoxy called Blade Bond to epoxy the handle and bolts together. The bolts are tightened down with a pair of screwdrivers and some carefully applied cursing. Next, I'll clean off the squeeze out with a solvent and finish clamping them up. After 24 hours of cure time, I'll grind the handle to its final shape. First, I grind the heads off the bolts, being careful not to overheat them. If you get them too hot, you can burn off your epoxy with predictably negative results. Then I'll soften and round off the handle to make it comfortable in the hand, as well as thinning the scales. We're aiming for a concealable blade that won't print through a concealment garment, so we don't want it super thick. I'm also putting in a finger notch for comfort and retention purposes, and because it looks kind of cool. I'll move up to higher grits to smooth it, then finish it by hand with 400 grit and then 600 grit sandpaper. Once I'm done, I'll polish it up using Walker wax. This is actually a product I'm not particularly familiar with that I just picked up from a guitar making supply house. I read the description and it seemed like it might be useful for knife making purposes, so I'm just going to try it out here. Hey, it gives a pretty nice result, doing a nice job of bringing out the wood grain look of the linen layers in the micarta. And here's the final result. Next, I'll pass it on to Peter Renwick and let him beta test it a little to see if it does what he was hoping for. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, here are a couple of other videos that you might be interested in. Also, like me on Facebook at Walter Sorrells Blades, and check out my website, waltersorrellsblades.com, where you'll find examples of my work, along with instructional videos showing all aspects of Japanese sword making, including forging and polishing, how to make hamones, and how to make fittings, scabbards, and handles for Japanese swords.